college thing. And then Kevin Murray and Travis Scott. Oh, God, that's a they got hurt.
Video presentation. Yeah.
Howdy, Yags. Welcome to Monday lunch. If y'all could please stand with me. We'll have John Kimbrough come up for prayer and pledge. Maybe a short story.
It's done for today.
It'll be a short story because the last one bombed, so there's not going to be one today. Pray with me, please. Loving Heavenly Father, we thank you again for the blessings that you blessed us with. Father, we pray for blessings on our country, our state, our city. Father, bless Texas A&M as it goes to work to educate our children here in Texas with the best education they can get. And be with us, Father, guide us and direct us, draw us nearer to you. In your name we pray, amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas
Flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible.
All right, this week we don't have any silver tabs to report unless somebody out there has got one. Vince?
I'd like to remember all the people who were killed at Oklahoma City bombing 26 years ago. Secret Service lost 64 agents and 2 military staff. I was set up there after that to be one of the families to fill in the body. It was one of our administrative staff, so please keep them in prayers. 26 years ago.
26 years ago, Oklahoma City bombing. If we could take a short time to have a moment of silence to honor those that lost. All right. New members and guests. Do we have any new members or guests out there?
Dave Thomas, and he's my guest for several times, and he's decided to join the club.
Thank you, Dave. Welcome. Anybody else out there? All right. I'd like to first thank Circle G Catering and Barbecue, David Gerke over there for the wonderful food. And then if you haven't got dessert in the back, the Aggie Women's Club, the only Aggie Women's Club, is back there with pies. So get back there and get your pies. They also have 2021 Fiesta medals for sale right now. All right, Aggie Athletics baseball team. They dropped 2 out of 3 to Arkansas over the weekend. Softball lost 2 out of 3 to Ole Miss. But in track and field, Athing Mew ran the fastest 800-meter ever run by a woman in college. I think it was a minute 57 seconds, somewhere in there. She won by 3 seconds, which is quite a bit in 800s. Men's and women's tennis. Dom Dixon, we have an update.
Yeah, the women won against Mississippi Saturday 4-0. The men won against Alabama 4-0. So we're doing well at home.
All right, men and women both swept. So. A&M had, the football team had a practice, and there was a sighting right here of Hulk Spider-Man. My son, he doesn't go anywhere without his Hulk hands and his Spider-Man shoes. So it was a fun time at Kyle Field to just let him run around. And football team looks great, and the quarterbacks are looking good. So I can't wait to see.
Is spring game this weekend?
Spring game is coming up this weekend, and A&M is still heavily favored to win it. So. All right, capital campaign. We've got 1.5 million raised, and we still need some more. So if you guys can dig deep and help us get home, we're breaking ground next month to start the project, and we're still short on our funds, so we're going to be fundraising through the end of the project to get caught up. We've got muster coming up Wednesday. Porter Garner is going to be the speaker, and right now we're restricting the attendance to family and friends of those on the roll call list. The current limit is 2 guests per roll call name. We're also going to live stream the event. Reagan has been doing a great job. He's the vice president this year and chair of that.
Will y'all send us the websites that we go to for the live stream?
It'll be on the Aggie Park website. You'll be able to click on the event, and there'll be a link right there to live stream it. Okay, on next Monday, April 26th, we're having the Aggie Park Blood Drive. This year we're doing a contest, the young Aggies against the old Aggies. All right? So if you're going to give blood, we need to have y'all sign up this week so that it's dependent on how many buses they'll bring out is how many people that we've got signed up. And so again, what's at stake in this bet is a Monday lunch. So it looks like we've got more old Ags than young Ags here. So this would be big for you guys. You know, this is a free lunch. So if y'all can be here for the blood drive, Steve.
I want to know what year you're classifying me as old.
We haven't figured that out yet. We're gonna take a look at the results and see how we can. No, we're gonna wait for the overnight results to come in, and then we'll tell you who won.
Separate the old blood and the new. I'd like to get some of that new.
There's only one way to find out. You got to be here, Mr. Souls. Becky, am I missing anything?
Points.
You get you get double points for donating blood. If you are O positive, you get double points. Where can you use those points, Becky?
On their website, Steve, what kind of prizes do they have? They have gift cards and.
Yeah, I usually convert mine into gift card. You get Amazon and a bunch of other places like that. And
You can convert those points into to use on their website for gift cards.
And is it $1 for $1? So you get 10 points for giving, so then you'll get $20 gift card for Amazon, and if you're a no blood type, you get $40.
Did I hear you say you had to register to do this?
It's registered on our website at
You just can't
aggiepark.com.
show up that day and give blood?
You can, it just helps them pre-plan that, it could cause some backups if we've got a lot more people coming than they're ready for.
there's plenty of openings right now.
Yeah, our goal is 50, so.
We're looking to get 50 donors.
Again, click the website and pick your time. You're good to go.
The time's from 1 to 6, so catch you after lunch or after work.
Alrighty. Aggie Family Barbecue. Steve's running it this year. Last year we cooked 900 barbecue plates, which I think is a record. I don't know if they've ever sold that many. There's a couple of people that have been to every barbecue ever sitting over here. They could probably tell us, but that was 120 pounds of sausage, and Reagan set a world record for how many pieces of sausage did you cut, Reagan?
Too many.
He cut every piece of sausage last year, and you see how his right forearm is bigger than his left. So our goal this year is 1,000 plates. So show up. It's going to be a great time here at the park. But also, if you can't be here, you can buy a plate that can be donated to the first responders. All right, Coach's Night. Jimbo's coming to town May 19th. We're having a big blowout event at Tejas Rodeo. It's a 35,000 square foot pavilion. So it's outdoors, but it's covered. And so that'll be a fun night. That's coming up May 19th. So reserve your table now because the spots are going pretty quick. We've got 2021 Fiesta medals coming up. Anybody missing one? We've got plenty over here for sale, and we're giving 2020s away for free if you get one. Membership directory. If you're a member, then we'll have your information, but please check and make sure it's updated. We're going to do a hard copy this year, and we want to get as many members as we can into this commemorative directory. And also, if you've got a business or know of an Aggie-owned business, there's a spot for them to sign up and have their business highlighted in the directory. We've got merchandise for sale online. Click on the link on our website, and you can search through all the different items that we've got this year. All right, upcoming Monday lunch. Reagan Frowling's going to come talk about that and introduce our speaker.
Howdy. Real quick before we get started, our illustrious secretary of the club has a birthday today. And yes, your wife told us this, Don, and so I think we should all have him stand and sing happy birthday. A 1 and a 2, a 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Don. Happy birthday to you. So, all right, happy birthday, Don. Okay, the next few weeks, we've got on April 26th, next week, to coincide with our blood drive, we've got Dr. Dib coming from University Health trauma surgeon. Also, May the 3rd, the week of Cinco de Mayo, we have Philip de la Peña coming to speak on that. May the 10th, no, May the 3rd will be the last Monday lunch here. We're going to move those over to Holy Spirit, right there at Blanco, right across from Eisenhower Park. We've got Mark printed out some maps up here if you need them. But we're going to meet there starting on May the 10th. That will get our construction project going. May the 17th, I'd like to have a really big crowd. Again, it's good to see everybody here today. We've got the dean from the A&M Law School coming. May the 24th, we have Mindy Miller for donor relations for the Canines for Warriors. Actually, excuse me, those two are switched. Mark, I told you wrong. The dean is coming on the 24th and Mindy is on the 17th. So those are upcoming lunches. Yes, sir.
Eisenhower Middle School, sir. Not Eisenhower Park.
Excuse me, Eisenhower Middle School. That would be quite a ways away. Thank you, Steve. Okay, let me try that again. Eisenhower Middle School. Holy Spirit is real close across the street from that. So today's speaker, we have Michael Smith with us, and we're grateful for him coming. We've got a lot of people that know Mike, and we're glad to have you with us. Mike holds a Juris Doctorate degree from the University of South Carolina School of Law and a PhD in Justice Studies from Arizona State University. He holds an impressive array of experience. He's a former law enforcement officer and a nationally recognized expert on racial profiling and the use of force. He's a criminologist and a former municipal and county police officer who served as a principal investigator on many grants and research contracts over his 20-year career as a police scholar and criminal justice researcher. He is a nationally recognized expert on racial profiling and the use of force, and led or contributed to large-scale traffic or pedestrian stop data analysis efforts in San Jose, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Miami-Dade County, Florida, Richmond, Virginia, and state highway patrol agencies in Washington and Arizona. He's also a good friend of Daryl here, but we won't count that against him. Is that all right, Daryl?
Yeah.
So please give a warm Aggie Park welcome to Mike Smith.
Hey, good afternoon,
It is afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me and for the wonderful lunch. It's been a while since I stood up in front of an audience because we've been teaching online for the last year, which is a little weird, but we're all kind of getting used to it. As Reagan mentioned, I'm professor at the University of Texas San Antonio here in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. I've been a professor for more than 25 years now. Was a police officer some years ago now. That's how I got into this business. But I study the police and I work with police agencies around the country, a variety of different things, many of which have to do with the things that you all are reading in the news right now as we speak. So I study what I term the critical issues in policing. So I study things like use of force or racial disparities in police-citizen contacts. We used to call that racial profiling when I first started doing it 25 years ago. Now it's racial disparities is the buzzword. Anyway, these are the things that I study, and it's what I want to talk to you a little bit about today. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. It's certainly a timely subject, unfortunately. So that's a little bit about who I am. What we're kind of living through, this cycle that we're living through right now, since the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May, is actually not unusual. And this little timeline gives you an example of what I'm talking about. So in modern times anyway, we can kind of trace these events, these instances of police use of force, public outcry and protests over it back to the 60s. So in the summer of 1967, for example, in the height of the civil war rights era in the Vietnam War era, there was a spasm of riots across the United States in one summer. 23 cities burned. Now, almost all of those incidents were touched off by some event involving the use of force by the police. Some of you may remember Rodney King in 1991. That was another watershed moment for American policing. And then in 2014, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And we had protests, nationwide protests as a result of that. And then that brings us up to today, of course, with George Floyd and what we're living through right now. So it is a long and sad story in American life. We're a nation that prides itself on independence and freedom. We're generally, as a people, distrustful of the government. And all of that plays out when you bring police officers into contact with ordinary, everyday people. And when you throw in violence and the use of force, then it's a toxic mix. And so we go through this cycle. I like to think I've been studying this phenomena for a long time, and I like to think that we're getting better incrementally. Policing is getting better incrementally, and I think that's largely true. But it continues to be a troublesome profession and a troublesome relationship between police and many communities, particularly communities of color. So, we see these videos, and I've got a couple I'm going to show you in a little while. We see these videos, police-involved shootings or other kinds of events where the police are in conflict, physical conflict with people, and it raises this question about why does this keep happening over and over again? What is it that is behind that kind of conflict? So there's a guy named Egon Bittner who's a thought leader in police circles going back many years ago now.
You wrote a book called The Functions of Police in the Modern Society, and those of us that study the police, criminologists like me, and we teach this sort of thing to students, both undergraduate and grad students. We go back to this book. I go back to this book all the time, and that highlighted quote from his book is really, I think, very apropos. So Bittner said that the role of the police is best understood as the mechanism for the distribution of non-negotiably coercive force employed in accordance with the dictates of an intuitive grasp of situational exigencies. That's a mouthful, but to translate that to plain English, we have the police to do things that the rest of us either don't want to do or are not empowered to do. So the role of the police is really to show up, and if push comes to shove, to make people do things they don't want to do. That's basically what Bittner said 40 years ago, almost 50 years ago now, and that's basically true today. Now, there's lots of things that the police do that don't involve coercion, and most of what they do, in fact, does not. But when it comes down to it, there's a reason that we call 911, and we want the police to show up, right? And that's really the core of their role. Okay. So I get this question a lot. I talk to audiences of various kinds like this, lay people as well as professional audiences. And I get this question a lot about, is what this officer did legal? I get these kind of what ifs from students all the time. Well, I was out with my friends last Friday night and this cop stopped us and he did this, and can he do that? So let's talk a little bit about what the rules are that govern the use of force by police that we see on TV over and over again, or on our computers. So the Supreme Court decided a case in 1989 called Graham versus Conner. It's the sort of the foundational case that we look to for the rules that govern the use of force by police in a general sense. And I'll cut to the chase because I know we're a little over time. So if you look at the bottom bullet point there, how do we determine whether or not what the police did in terms of using force is appropriate from a legal or constitutional perspective? The Supreme Court gave us the answer in this case, Graham versus Conner, and they said that basically that the standard for judging whether force was reasonable is an objective one. It's not what I think or what you think or what the guy over there thinks. It's what the hypothetical reasonable person would have done, reasonably well-trained police officer under the circumstances. What would that hypothetically reasonable, well-trained police officer have done under those set of circumstances? And the Supreme Court gave us some factors that we're maybe supposed to look to in making that determination. How serious was the crime? What was the threat that was posed by the suspect to the officers or to a third party? And what was the subject doing? Was he resisting arrest? Was he attempting to get away? These are the things that the court said that we should think about and consider when looking at that objectively reasonable test, right? Or applying that objectively reasonable test. So that's where we start. So when you watch a video, the next video that hits your news feed on your phone or your iPad or whatever news it is that you watch on TV, when you see that next video, understand that police are trained to this standard in police academies all over the country. And eventually they will be judged by their leadership within their organization, by prosecutors, by courts, occasionally by juries, based on this standard right here. Okay. And I think maybe before we go to the next, so I'll go to the next slide, talking about deadly force, and then back up for a minute, tell you a little bit about the police environment as it exists today. So much of the controversy that occurs around the use of force by police involves shootings, right? The application of deadly force by the police against some civilian. Those videos are the ones that seem to capture the nation's attention more than others. The George Floyd case was a little bit of an anomaly. George Floyd died, was killed by officers in Minneapolis, not with a handgun, right? But through the application of physical force. And so, but that case aside, most of the cases that have caused so many problems over the years have been shootings. Supreme Court decided a case in 1985 that deals directly with the use of deadly force by the police. And it is the foundation remains the foundation to this day for how the police can use deadly force. And prior to Garner, the state of Tennessee had a statute that allowed the police to use deadly force to apprehend fleeing felons. So if you were wanted for a felony and you were running away from the police in 1979, which is when the officer involved in this case shot and killed a teenage burglary suspect who was fleeing from a house. He shot him as he was going in the back of the head as he was jumping over a fence trying to get away. And in those days in Tennessee, that was legal. It was legal in a lot of states back then. The Supreme Court changed the playing field in 1985 with this case. And they held in Tennessee versus Garner that it's no longer constitutional for the police to use deadly force to shoot and to apprehend a fleeing felon unless that individual posed a risk of serious injury or death to the officer or someone else. So the old fleeing felon rule went away in 1985 to be replaced by this rule, right? Deadly force is only appropriate now when the individual against whom that force is being used poses a serious risk of death or serious injury. Okay. So how does all that, what does all that mean in terms of everyday practice in policing? So I'm going to pause just a minute and talk a little bit about the environment. We police ourselves in the United States much differently than any other country in the world. So we have a little over 18,000 police departments in the United States. That's a huge number. So by way of comparison, every other Western democracy that you could think of, Canada, Australia, Great Britain, France, Germany, any other Western democracy has at most a dozen or a couple dozen police agencies for the entire country. Many of them, Germany, for example, Germany has a single national police force. We have 18,000 police departments in the United States. So when you hear people talk about the police, the catchword right now is police reform, whatever that looks like or means to you. But it's all over the news, right? All over the media, all over, the pundits are talking about it. People are writing about it in the newspaper. We need police reform. Well, keep in mind that there is no single police. There's 18,000 police departments in the United States. And half of them have 25 or fewer officers. So policing in the United States is largely a small town affair. Okay. What captures most of the attention are big cities, shootings or other things that occur in big cities, because they're big cities and that's where a lot of the action is. But that's not where policing really is all about in the US. It's a small town affair. Every town, every village, every county, they all want to have their own police department. That's how we're wired. That's how we've been set up for 250 years. So it makes it very challenging to reform the police because there's 18,000 police agencies and about 750,000 police officers across those 18,000 police departments. And none of them, by the way, are under control of the federal government. They are all locally controlled, either at the state or at the local level. And the federal government has a limited ability to make local police agencies do or not do anything. So it's, it's a very, very decentralized environment, is what I'm suggesting to you. And so it makes it, so change then, implementing change is difficult to do across 18,000 agencies, every one of them with a different culture, every one of them with a different agenda, right? So that's what makes it particularly challenging when things like George Floyd happen, and you hear calls from all over the country about, well, we need to reform the police. Okay. So in practice then, those rules, those legal rules I told you about a second ago, they're put into effect within each of those 18,000 police departments through policies and procedures, training that officers get either in the academy or on the job. Okay. And they generally follow something that looks like this. Okay. Doesn't always look like this. Remember, there's 18,000 police departments. Every one of them's got a different set of policies and procedures. There's a lot of commonality. Yes, there's a lot of divergence as well. But generally speaking, and I know this is hard to see a little bit from where you are, but police are generally trained to follow a continuum, right? If they can, right? So the idea is that, remember, the officers are supposed to use force that's reasonable under the circumstances, and they're supposed to escalate that force depending on the threat, or de-escalate it as the threat diminishes. Somewhere, kind of, sort of, along a continuum, right? And so down here at the bottom, you've got, just the officer's presence in uniform, maybe ordering someone to turn around and put your hands behind your back, you're under arrest. That's a low level of coercion. You kind of move up the pyramid there and you get into that blue band. And you've got kind of lower level physical force. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. I don't think I'm going to do that. Well, yeah, you need to do that. And so I'm going to put my hands on you and I'm going to make you do that. And I'm going to leverage your hands behind your back, or I'm going to take you to the ground, or something like that. That's this sort of lower level physical force. And that's really where most of the force action is, by the way. Most use of force by police is in that blue band right there. Doesn't ever go anything above that. Okay. Somewhere between 70 and 80% of it, by the way, is right there. You go up to the next level, that's kind of that pinkish color, at least on my screen, that's kind of pinkish. And you've got things like, police carry all this stuff, right, on their belts, We had an incident, a very unfortunate incident last week where an officer at some suburban department outside of Minneapolis shot a kid, young guy, trying to get in a car, trying to get away from the police, right? She shot him. She meant, from all appearances, she meant to tase him. She meant to hit him with a taser. Somehow, she drew her firearm instead of her taser, and she shot him. The taser fits in there, though. It fits in here, right? So police carry tasers. By the way, most modern police departments put them on the others. They put them on the weak side. So if you're right-handed, the taser is going to go on your left side, precisely so you don't accidentally pull your taser instead of your firearm. That's what she did. It appears anyway. So taser goes in there. Police still carry batons. They're instead of the old wooden baton that I used to carry. They're collapsible metal batons. Take them out, flick them, they open up, and you basically got a steel rod, right? You carry pepper spray, right? Things like that. This is all sort of in that less lethal force environment. There's other more fancy things they carry nowadays, but you get the idea. So there's, particularly with the advent of the taser, and the taser's been around for a long time, but the modern iteration of the taser has been around about 20 years. And it's proliferated. 90% of police departments equip their officers with tasers now. And so the use of the taser has gone up a lot, right? So I told you most of the action is at that low level kind of force, but there's a fair number of cases that involve the use of the taser, more than anything else, by the way. So that's that. And then the top level, of course, is deadly force. When we think of that, typically the use of a firearm, police are armed in the United States. It's not like Great Britain, where most officers don't carry firearms. We're in a nation of, 250 million guns. Cops are gonna have guns. And so that's where most deadly force lies, is in the use of firearms. Occasionally, like in the case of a George Floyd, someone can get killed at the hands of the police through some means other than a firearm. Okay. So we're at this sort of the latest inflection point after the George Floyd killing. But what do we do? How can we train the police better? How can we, lead them better? How can we supervise them better? How can we punish them more, if that's what it takes, to keep these things from happening over and over again? So there's a number of issues that are sort of at the forefront of discussion right now in policing circles. One of them is, should we require officers to retreat before deadly force if it's safe for them to do so? And this is particularly relevant in cases where the person that the officers are confronting is armed with something other than a gun, right? So you have a lot of police shootings that happen, and I'll talk about how many of them that there actually are in a minute. It's actually, about 1,000, by the way, deaths. Police kill about 1,000 people a year in the United States, and that's been a fairly stable number for the last probably 10 years. But in a lot of times they get into armed confrontations with people who don't have guns, but they've got other things. They've got knives, or they've got a brick, or they've got a sword, or shoot that guy. The guy was armed with a knife, and he's 25 feet away from you. You have to shoot him. So that's a key issue that's sort of being debated right now in policing circles. And to what degree do we want the police to de-escalate those situations, right? To not take steps that's going to, more likely create additional upset, right? And conflict, rather than trying to calm things down and maybe create some distance and some space and that sort of thing. So that's an issue. This one here is highlighted. I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to show you these videos in a second. How do we improve officer decision-making under conditions of extreme stress? Because this is the reality of police work. It doesn't happen. It's not like TV. It doesn't happen very often. But when it happens, it's real, right? And police are called on to make split-second decisions under the most extreme kinds of circumstances. And sometimes they're wrong, and they make bad decisions. And so the question is, how do we improve that, right? How do we improve that decision-making ability under conditions of extreme stress? And then this one here. There's a piece of legislation that's in Congress right now, moving its way through Congress on police reform. And I read a synopsis of it this morning in the Washington Post. And so it will do things like prohibit shooting at or from a moving vehicle, prohibit chokeholds, right? By the way, most police departments prohibited chokeholds a long time ago, right? Unless it's a deadly force situation where you're having to choke somebody out to save your own life, chokeholds have been banned in most larger agencies for a long time. So I'm not sure what that's going to do. Maybe make somebody feel good, but in terms of a practical impact, it's not going to have much of a practical impact. Okay. All right. So here. Here's that video. I want to show you, because this gives you an example of the kind of split-second decision-making that I'm talking about. Okay. Not sure what happened exit out of PowerPoint. So this is a shooting that occurred just last year in Washington, D.C. This is a
Community briefing involving the fatal shooting of Mr. Dion K. involving a uniformed police officer on Wednesday, September 2nd, 2020, in the 200 block of Orange Street
what you see is
Southeast.
how quickly this unfolds.
All viewers should be aware that this contains graphic content of a fatal shooting. The Metropolitan Police Department's model use of force policy and training emphasize de-escalation, proportionality, and reasonableness. Above all, MPD recognizes the sanctity of human life and that any loss of life is a tragic outcome for a family and a community. Since December 2016, all patrol officers are required to wear body-worn cameras. On Wednesday, September 2nd, 2020, at approximately 3:49 p.m., uniformed MPD officers were in the area of the 200 block of Orange Street Southeast to investigate a man with a gun. Upon arrival, the officers approached individuals in a parked vehicle. Mr. Dion K. exited the vehicle and began to run on foot. Officers pursued Mr. K on foot. An officer observed Mr. K brandish a firearm, and subsequently the officer discharged his service weapon once, striking Mr. K in the chest.
Hey, shots fired.
So that's it. It happened just that fast. I'm gonna scroll, and there's some interim parts of the video here where the officer's looking for the gun that the guy had in his hand, that he actually ended up throwing down into this field on the other side of that playground equipment. But I'll show you, but you didn't, my guess is you didn't see that, right? Did you see a gun in his hand? No, right. All right. Okay, this is the officer down looking in the field for the gun. He's actually, I think, found the gun at this point.
The one that he was holding. You good? I'm good. I'm involved.
When the video is brought to slow motion, you can see Mr. K brandish a firearm in his right hand.
So what he was doing, it turns out, this guy, the bad guy here, he was being chased by the officers. There's two of them. The other one, whose body cam you're seeing, is obviously in front of him. He was trying to throw that gun. He was trying to get rid of it. And he actually ended up throwing it 30 yards over the officer's head into that field behind it. But at the moment that the officer pulled the trigger, all he saw was this gun coming up like this. And he pulled the trigger. And it happened that fast. And that's what, again, not all the time, not nearly as much as TV makes it seem like, but enough times police are confronted with having to make decisions like that. And they have about that long oftentimes to make those decisions, which is what makes it so challenging, of course, right? Okay. So let me talk just a couple more minutes and I'll take questions about what I call the elephant in the room, which is the issue of race. And to what degree does race play into the decisions that police officers make every day on the street about whether to use force or not to use force? So people like me have been studying this very issue for 40 years. I personally have been involved in probably half a dozen large-scale social science research projects that have looked at this I've got one right now, by the way, in Fairfax County, Virginia. people like me, criminologists, it's not CSI and we're not criminal profiles. What we do is we take data and we analyze that data using science to see if we can uncover patterns and trends in that data. And then what I do is I then work with police departments to help them get better, right? What does the data tell us? What story does the data tell us? And then if it's not a good story, then how do we make it better next time? That's the work that I've done and I continue to do with police departments for 25 years. So this is the question. Do police disproportionately use force against minority civilians? It's a key question. It comes up over and over again, right? It's what underlied the 23 riots in the United States in the summer of 1967, right? It was the issue in Rodney King in 1991. It was the issue in Michael Brown in 2014. And it is the issue today in the killing of George Floyd. What do we know? We've been studying this for 40 years. What do we know? Well, this is 40 years of research boiled down to one sentence. The evidence is mixed. Remember, there's 18,000 police departments. They're all different. Not all of them have been studied. The vast majority of them have not. The ones that have been studied tend to be studied over and over again because they're the bigger cities, right? But what do we know based on that research? Most studies, including all of the ones that I've been involved in personally over the last 25 years, find no race effect after other relevant legal considerations are taken into account. So when I say no race effect, what I mean is that most studies have found that the race of the civilian doesn't affect the decision that the police officers make in most of the published research, the peer-reviewed research that you'll find out there, okay? Once you control for these other relevant factors, the number one predictor of force used by the police is resistance by the subject. That's the number one predictor of force. Police officers are taught to escalate and de-escalate force, and that's exactly what they do. When people comply, 9 times out of 10, everyone goes home safe. It's when they resist, when they don't comply, that force escalates. But in the process of that, race typically does not play a role. That's surprising to a lot of people. Depending on the audience I'm talking to, some people want to drag me off the stage when I say that because they don't believe it. Believe it. I've been doing this a long time, and that's what the data show. With respect to deadly force, which is perhaps the most contentious issue, right? When police shoot people, do they shoot them because they're one race or another? Or does that impact the decisions that they make? A couple of things. There's no national database. There's no police use of force national database. By the way, we desperately need one, okay? We don't have one. There's been talk about trying to develop one for 30 years. For all of the reasons I talked about earlier about the decentralized nature of policing is the reason why we don't have one. So we don't have perfect data when it comes to police shootings. But the data that we do have, when we study it in the best way that science knows how, we reach the same conclusion that I mentioned earlier. That is that most studies find no race effect when other relevant legal considerations are taken into account. Before lunch today, somebody came up to me and was asking me about this benchmarking question, right? And I told you I would speak to it. So when you read news accounts of, you watch CNN or even Fox News, right? News accounts of police use of force, particularly police shootings. What the media likes to do is they like to make these comparisons. The police shot X number of people, about 1,000 last year, and about 40% of them were African Americans. African Americans make up only 13% of the population. Therefore, the police must be acting in discriminatory ways, right? Because they're shooting African Americans at rates that far exceed the representation in the population. So as a scientist, I will tell you that that is an inappropriate, it's a scientifically invalid comparison to make. The media does it because it sells clicks, sells newspapers. It's also easy to do because you can pull the census data down for free and you can run a little crosstab and 5 minutes later you have your answer. It's the wrong answer, but you have an answer. So what we do in social science is we study benchmarks, comparison populations that make more sense, right? Because not every racial group is at equal risk of being shot by the police. And I say that with no bias or discriminatory intent at all. That is an empirical fact. Some racial groups are involved in violent crime more than other racial groups. And it puts those racial groups at risk, greater risk for being shot by the police than other racial groups. And when I say that, I will always follow up by saying this. Who commits most of the white collar crime? Bernie Madoff just died in prison. You guys remember who Bernie Madoff was, right? He built people out of billions of dollars. He just died in prison last week. What race and ethnicity was Bernie Madoff? He was a white guy, right? 95% of white collar crime was committed by people that look like me. Street crime, violent street crime, is disproportionately committed by people of color. That is an empirical reality. I wish it weren't so. It's a sad commentary on our society, quite frankly, but it is what it is. The police don't make those rules. They just have to play on the field. And so the appropriate comparison population is not the residential population, not the people who live in the United States. It's who's involved in violent crime, okay? Who's involved in violent arrests. That's the appropriate benchmark population. That's what people like me use when we compare rates of police shootings by race. It's the work that I'm doing in a couple of police departments right now. Okay. Now, all that said, there is very good evidence, very good social science evidence, 40 years worth, that you and I have biases. We have biases that we don't know that we have. They're called implicit biases, right? We see a person and we make judgments about that person. Our brains are wired to do that, evolutionarily wise, by the way. We make these judgments in a split second. We're not even aware that we're making them. And those decisions or those judgments we make can be affected by the color of somebody's skin. We know this. What we don't have nearly as good evidence to show, though, is that because we hold these implicit biases, does it actually influence the way we behave? That connection is not nearly as strong as science tells us that about having those biases. Okay, so there's efforts underway to try to undo, right, the implicit biases that we all carry, and every racial group carries them, by the way. It's not just the white majority that carries biases. So how do we undo them? Can we train it out of people? The answer is no. At least we haven't been able to figure out how to do that yet. Okay, and there's been lots of attempts, particularly the last 5 years. Police departments have invested millions of dollars in implicit bias training to try to train implicit bias out of police officers to no effect. Okay, it doesn't work. It's not that maybe one day we'll be able to figure out how to do it. We don't know how to do that yet. Okay, so what do we do in the interim then? Well, there is some evidence that training officers in de-escalation techniques, calm it down, right? Slow things down, put some distance between you and that guy with the knife. Get yourself behind cover where if he charges you or he shoots at you, it's not going to hit you, it's going to hit that, that steel mailbox that you're hiding behind or something like that, right? And then talk to the person, right? What do you see in these videos over and over again the police are doing? They're screaming at the guy, right? over and over again. Drop the gun, drop the gun, drop the gun. Just like that. And sometimes the guy doesn't drop the gun, right? Because you just ratcheted up the emotion in that already tense situation by the way that the officer is behaving. So what this training tries to do is it tries to undo that, try to flip it on its head, right? To try to get officers to take a step back from the emotion of the moment and to try to slow things down, to calm things down. There's some evidence emerging that kind of training can have an impact, right? It can actually change behavior, police behavior on the street, and reduce the number of cases of force that a police department sees in the aggregate. Okay. All right, and so where do we go from here? That's the end. Where do we go from here? So there's a national police think tank called the Police Executive Research Forum. That's the acronym there, PERF. A few years they came out with a publication called PERF's 30 Principles, made up by sort of progressive police chiefs and sheriffs from around the country. Came up with this list of 30 principles. It's not been without its critics, by the way. Other police organizations, the IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, by the way, doesn't like the PERF principles. They came up with their own sort of set of rules or prescriptions. I put these up just for food for thought, right? So how can we make things better? How can we reduce the George Floyd cases or the Michael Brown cases? De-escalation training, some evidence that it might be having an effect. Things like judging officers, and this is where PERF got itself into some controversy with some police organizations, judging officers not at the moment that they pull the trigger. Remember the video I showed you, right? So was it reasonable for the officer to pull the trigger at the moment that guy was bringing his gun up? Undoubtedly, yes. Okay. The question is, and I'm passing no judgment on that officer. I'm throwing this out just to make a point. Should he have been chasing him in the first place? Or should he have been chasing him in the manner in which he was chasing him in the first place? I think the answer is yes, by the way, to both of those questions. But you can imagine a scenario where it wouldn't be yes, right? Where, the officer has done something that escalated the situation unnecessarily. And so what some police departments are doing is they're beginning to build that into their policies, right? So we're not going to just evaluate your behavior at the moment you pull the trigger, but we're going to go back 5 minutes and we're going to evaluate your behavior that led up to the moment that you pulled the trigger to see whether or not did you do something that made the situation worse, right? And if you did, how can we keep you from doing that next time? How can we train officers in ways that will not, in ways where they don't exacerbate what are already tense situations, okay? And a variety of other things you can see there. So anyway, that's my presentation for the day, and I'm happy to take questions or to dodge anything you want to throw at me.
What is the real qualified immunity for police officers, and how is it repealed, in your opinion, going to affect recruiting and retention of officers?
So qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that was judicially created by the Supreme Court. So there's a federal statute that allows private citizens to sue police officers for violating their constitutional rights and to recover money damages for those violations. Qualified immunity was a judicial rule that was created by the court to try to cut some of those lawsuits off before they went to trial. And so basically the rule is if a reasonable police officer wouldn't have known that what he or she did at the moment was unconstitutional at the time that he did it, then the officer ought not to be subjected to civil liability under this particular federal statute, right? That's the qualified immunity doctrine. So basically the argument is, I didn't know. When I did this thing, whatever it was, it wasn't clear. There wasn't a clearly established rule that said I couldn't do it. So it's not fair then for you as a court to hold me civilly liable for something that wasn't clear when I did it. And so qualified immunity would come in and it would cut that lawsuit off at the summary judgment stage, and it would never go to a jury. It would be dismissed. That's what qualified immunity means. If you do away with it, then a lot more of those cases are going to go to a jury. Okay, that doesn't mean that the officer is going to automatically be found liable, but there's going to be an opportunity for a jury to weigh in a significantly higher percentage of cases than occur right now. So that's what qualified immunity is. You know, your question is, you know, what is it going to do to the ability to hire or retain officers? Well, I mean, it's a very good question. We don't really know the answer yet because qualified immunity hasn't been abolished. I kind of doubt that some states have taken that, have tried to do that at the state level already as part of the police reform movement. I have my doubts as to whether or not a law like that's going to get through the United States Congress. But I guess we'll see. I mean, if that happens. Look, I'll work my way up to the front, all the way in the back, sir.
What is the reason the state legislature is discussing having no license, no reason, whatever, to carry a gun, just carry it around?
I think that's a political question that I'm not really qualified to answer as to why they're doing that. I can tell you that there's about 13 states, give or take now, that allow constitutional carry, concealed handgun carry without requiring a permit of any kind. As long as you're not a convicted felon or you haven't been adjudicated mentally ill, in those states you can carry a concealed weapon. So I did a research study specifically looking at the impact of the movement from a fairly liberal permit regime in Arizona. Arizona had rules for concealed carry like we have in Texas about 5-6 years ago. They then moved to the constitutional carry thing that you're talking about, where you don't have to have a license to carry a concealed gun anymore. The question was, what did that do to crime, right? Did crime go down, right? If you're a gun right advocate, then the argument is, more guns, less crime. If you're a gun control person and you say, you got all these people running around carrying guns, they don't have to have a permit, you're gonna have more shootings and more violence. The question I looked at was, in Arizona, what was the impact of moving from a permit regime to a constitutional carry regime in the city of Tucson, Arizona's second largest city? What I found is that the movement to constitutional carry had no impact one way or the other. It didn't increase crime. It didn't increase shootings or aggravated assaults or homicides or even suicides. But it also didn't make it better, like the sort of Second Amendment crowd was arguing that it would. It just had no effect, right? So I can't say that that's what would happen in Texas too. I can tell you that that's what happened in Tucson, Arizona when the law was changed. In the very, very back, sir.
The question is, the 1,000 that you mentioned, what percentage do you think of that number could have been avoided had the subject simply complied initially with the police officer's request?
Right. The answer is probably most of them. The answer is probably most of them from a sort of a but-for, causation standpoint. But the issue really is, and it's a valid point, right? The example of the young man that was shot by the female officer who thought she was trying to tase him, right? He was in a position to get shot instead of tased because he wasn't doing what the police told him to do over and over again, and he was fighting with him and trying to get in his car to drive away. Had he not been doing that, he wouldn't have gotten shot. And it's a valid point, right? That said, police just can't shoot people because they're not doing what they're told to do. right? We got a set of rules about reasonableness and immediate threats of death or serious bodily injury that come into play here, right? And so, you know, it's a good question. I think your point underlying your question is a valid one. But, you know, it's not the Wild West anymore, right? And we're still going to hold the police accountable to acting within the Constitution. And the Constitution right now requires that there be an immediate threat of death or serious injury to somebody before the police can shoot. I'll get you next. Go ahead.
Yeah. Have you looked at the difference or I guess the correlation between experience bias and racial bias? Because if I was a cop and 80% of all bad situations I got in previously were from somebody of color, would that not translate automatically and become racial bias?
To how you pigeonhole that person in your brain.
Yeah.
So I wrote a paper about probably 10 years ago now. That was sort of I was one of the earliest, maybe the earliest social scientists to examine this question of racial profiling. And I did that work almost exclusively for 10 years, the first decade of the 21st century. And after doing that work for 10 years, and I saw repetitively, regardless of the police department, how big it was, what part of the country it was in, whether it was a sheriff's department, a police department, a highway patrol, I looked at millions of records of traffic stops, and the pattern was always the same. African Americans often more likely to be stopped, more likely to be searched, less likely to be found with contraband after it's searched, by the way, across all these different police departments. And so I started thinking, what's behind this? Like, I was a cop. I worked with police departments for 25 years. I've got hundreds of friends who are police officers. My brother's a retired police officer. I had lunch with a retired police officer. You know, I love cops. And I know that cops are not out there stopping people because the vast majority of them are not stopping people because of the color of their skin. And yet the data are what they are. I'm a social scientist. Those are what the data show. Why is that, right? And so I wrote a paper that tried to explain that, right? And what you just asked me is a large component of that theory that my colleague and I came up with. And it's, you know, and then there's good psychological research behind what I'm about to say. So differential exposure to criminality has a differential impact, right? So if you, and where I worked, I was a police officer in the inner city of Richmond, Virginia. On my beat, on any given day, I promise you, I was the only white guy there. Okay. I worked in that environment for 2 straight years. One of the most violent cities in America was the second highest homicide rate in the United States at the time that I policed there. And that's what I saw over and over and over again. You can't tell me that didn't have an impact on me, whether I thought it did or not. You can't tell me that it didn't. And that's your point, I think, right? And so, and there's good psychological research, by the way. It's not just me standing up here and telling you, or you asking the question. Like, we know that differential exposure to group criminality, you know, it impacts the way that we see those groups. The question is, what do we do about it? You know, modern implicit bias training doesn't work. We tried it, you know, for, you know, extensively, and it doesn't work. I've got a theory about maybe how to blunt that impact, and it has to do with taking people out of that environment, you know, and rotating them out of those high crime neighborhoods that are disproportionately populated with persons of color when you can, and rotating them out of there on a regular basis and trying to get them exposure to more normal set of circumstances, right? To maybe try to help blunt that impact. It's a very good question.
So my question is there any research that shows that maybe in today's society there's more shootings that are life-threatening as opposed to shootings in the past where a police officer would shoot the suspect, but wouldn't necessarily shoot to kill.
No, there's no research to suggest that. And in fact, so violent crime is much lower now than it was at its height. In about the mid 80s is when violent crime, mid to late 80s was sort of when it was at its height in terms of our modern measurement of it. And it's declined pretty much steadily for 30 years. Police officers have always, and I say always, I can't speak to how they were trained in the 1920s, but in modern times anyway, police officers are trained to shoot in certain ways. They're trained to shoot at the biggest target that they can hit, and that's right here, okay? They're not trained, nor are they equipped in a real life environment to shoot people in the leg or in the arm, to shoot a gun out of their hand, anything like that. You know, if you're a sniper and you're 100 yards away and you've got a red dot scope and you've got 5 minutes to focus on your target, maybe look at that video I showed you. You think that officer was pulling the trigger to save his life, and that's how police are trained, right? And that's how 95% of police shootings unfold, is like that, and that's why officers are trained to shoot at the biggest target that they can hit, and that's right here.
I guess my follow-up, so my question is, there was a shooting where a police officer pulled over a kid who was driving recklessly, and as he approached the side of the vehicle, you could see that the kid was still trying to get away.
Mm-hmm.
But the police officer wasn't necessarily in the line where he could have been hit.
Right.
And once the kid pulled forward again.
Right. Sure. So one of the PERF principles on my slide there a second ago was prohibiting shooting at or from the moving vehicle. There's a lot of cases like that, where the officers are shooting at somebody who's attempting to drive away, and the officer's argument is, well, he's going to run me over. That's actually pretty rare, right? Where the officer couldn't have stepped out of the way, or maybe wasn't even in the path of the vehicle in your hypothetical or your case at all, right? And so, there's efforts to try to rein that in through policy and training, where either prohibit it entirely or you make it very explicit the officer has to take reasonable steps to get himself out of the path of the moving vehicle before using deadly force, right?
You stated that most of the lethal situations come because the suspect didn't do what they're asked to do.
Yes.
Has there been any studies on that as to how many of the times the people reacted that way because they just didn't want to get caught versus an untrust of the police? Because we have situations now where they're generationally taught that you cannot trust the police, and therefore you don't have to show them the authority.
Right.
Has there been any studies to kind of determine the two factors?
So, what's the underlying motive for why the subject didn't comply? I think is your question. There's no research to my knowledge that's specifically examined that question. It's a good question. Anecdotally, in my experience, both on the street and as a researcher, most use of force cases where subjects are resisting, they're not attempting to assault the police officer. They're attempting to get away, right? Now they'll use force to try to get away, right? They'll try to pull your hands off them. They'll elbow you in the face if they can. They'll go run, jump in a car if they can. But their object is not to hurt you, right? Most of the time. When you run up against somebody who actually that's his intent, you know it. And it's a very different thing from a police officer's perspective than the guy who's fighting and struggling like crazy to try to get away from you.
Final question.
Steve.
Don't judge us all by the actions of a few.
I think that's a statement, but I would agree.
Don't judge us all by the actions of a few.
Mike, thank you very much. I appreciate it. My apologies to everyone. We had some technical difficulties to get going, but we ran over a little bit. Mike, we could have listened to you for another hour. Appreciate what you do. Mike, in appreciation from the club, we have a box of Boulder Spices, Aggie owned and operated, we'd like to give you for coming out today. Thank you very much. And we'll see everybody